This is Chthonica episode 5. I'm your host, Greg Greene. Chthonica, the podcast about horror in all its fictional forms. And with me today is John F.D. Taff. First, John, what does the F stand for and the D stand for? Those were not your elementary school grades, I take it.
Well, I was raised Catholic, so I was named after Kennedy, originally John Fitzgerald Taff. And my as part of being raised Catholic, you go through confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
You have to choose a saint's name. So I don't know how I exactly got my parents to agree to let me to choose Saint Damien, but I did. So yes, John Fitzgerald Damien Taff.
That is pretty awesome. Okay, well, I don't blame you for keeping the F and the D in the middle there. That's pretty amazing. That's great. And for if somebody is watching this or listening to this and they're not familiar with your work, well, first, yes, you're an editor and an anthologist, but also a pretty prolific author. I was just looking at the one of my favorite websites, Internet Speculative Fiction Database, isfdb.com. You've got listed there, is it 67 short stories?
It's more like closer to 150 now.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I always, never know how up to date this is, but 150 short stories. It lists one novel, The Bell Witch.
7 novels.
7. Okay. Yeah. All right. So this is clearly out of date. But I gotta ask, the Bell Witch that's the Bell Witch of Tennessee, right?
Yeah. That was one of the first novels I wrote. Gosh, that's probably 30 some odd years old.
Okay. Did you come to Tennessee I live in Nashville, so I got to ask about the Bell Witch. Yeah, it's just outside of Nashville.
One of my jobs, I was really into trade magazine publishing when I worked full time.
Yeah.
And I worked for a company that produced an art magazine called Decor. And I started out as a marketing manager for that magazine and a trade salesman for advertising sales. So the territory I had was basically the southeast of Missouri, of the United States.
Yep.
And so I went into Tennessee a lot. And so when I was in Nashville, I would shoot up to Adams, Tennessee,
yep,
which is where it took place.
Yep.
So yeah, I've been up there probably half a dozen times to do, research and poke around and that sort of thing. So
nice. That's cool. Yeah. As far as I know, yeah, it's a beautiful area. As far as I know, it's still it's supposed to be like the only like death certificate where supernatural causes was listed. That's the cause of death. It was John Bell. So
it's a cool story.
Yeah.
And I was attracted to that as a child when I read it as a kid. Mm-hmm. So I knew that when I started writing, it was something I wanted to explore when I started writing longer works like novels. So
yes. And in addition to those novels, I know you have a number of short story collections, and then 3 anthologies. Most recently, The Bad Book, which was just last year, and now Dark Stars coming out on March 22nd, in just a few days from this recording. So quite a prolific background in writing as well as editing. What drew you to horror in the first place? Movies, comics, books, whatever.
My mother was a big believer in reading. My family growing up, we were all big readers. Mm-hmm. And my mother was really into horror films. My dad was a cop.
Oh, wow.
And he worked weird hours and at the time I had to work a secondary job. So he was very seldom at home. And my mom was relatively young. She had my brother and sister and I. And she liked to watch these horror movies and didn't like to be up alone at night watching them. So she would keep us up to keep her company while she was watching these, the old Universal monster movies and the Hammer, Dracula films with
really
and stuff. So
I
got a visual education in horror pretty early on.
Wow.
And loved all that stuff. Loved, like Abbott and Costello movies when they met the Wolfman or they met Dracula or whatever. So When I first started reading was comic books, and then comic books kind of segued into science fiction.
Mm.
So I plowed through that, and then when I got to the point where I was looking for something new, I went into fantasy
Mm.
and read Tolkien and Donaldson and people like that. And then, when I was about 16, I started reading horror again. Started with Poe, and then just kind of moved into King and Straub and Barker and Rice. And then at the point where I thought that I was ready to start writing, I was reading horror. So it just seemed natural to sort of exercise that in that way. Mm-hmm. And, it's a great genre to be in. I still enjoy reading horror over just about anything else.
Yeah.
And it's fun to write. I mean, it's a fun, very expansive genre. I think, horror can do things that a lot of other genres can't do. They just can't be as wide ranging because, horror is based on emotion. It's not based on technology like science fiction or Westerns or, I think about the only genre that I can think of that's similar somewhat to horror is romance.
Interesting. That's right.
Is based on an emotion, love.
Yeah.
And that can be in any setting, at any time, anywhere, any place, just like horror.
Yeah, and I think science fiction, you think, well, it's wonder and it's the future. Well, it's also, I mean, it's just as frequently dread, probably more frequently dread than wonder, and those are very very different emotions there. But yeah, with horror, it does, there is that kind of range, that spectral, right. Pardon the pun, that spectral range there of horror that includes a number of emotions, but they all fit within it. They're going a certain direction.
Right.
For sure.
And as a writer, that's fun to play in because it lets you have this enormous palette to paint on. You don't feel like you can't do this or you can't do that. Whereas, something like science fiction, there are definite guide rails on that genre that it's really kind of hard to skirt out of. But, horror's a fun genre to write in. And I think that's what's kept me excited about writing in it.
Well, in your ISFDB author tags, with the profiles in your profile, the author tags, I don't know if you've seen these, but they include horror, alternate history, supernatural thriller, tattoos, golems, dogs, and death personified. So that's pretty far ranging and pretty awesome there.
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Given that.
Cool stuff there. Well, let's I want to talk about your upcoming book, Dark Stars.
Sure.
I think the first announcement of it came out maybe this time last year. Thank you. There you go. There's the printed copy of it, which just looks beautiful, and the Titan edition as well. Different cover, looks really, really cool too.
Yeah, they both did a really great job with the books.
Yes.
I'm really happy with both of them.
And as I understand, Tor Nightfire publishes it in the US, and Titan is the UK, right?
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, but damn, both editions look great. And in Dark Stars, Josh Malerman does the foreword to it and starts off by saying horror is having a moment, and then he goes on to describe this book as being kind of like a group photo of the 12 authors who are part of this moment, and their little get together, their party where they're all together at the cabin, and then on the front porch, let's snap a photo of them. And he goes in and describes what each one of them is doing. It's just a wonderful foreword.
It's great. That was a clever idea to do it that way.
I love it. And he doesn't stop there. I mean, he goes on to include, people who are like teenagers, kids writing their first horror stories right now, people who are 100 and older who are still getting a thrill out of writing horror, and just makes it of course, it's no surprise, no secret, certainly, that the horror community, certainly in the social media space, which can be a pretty bitter and divisive space, the horror community is one of the warmest, most welcoming, friendliest, and encouraging groups out there. And I think it seems like the camaraderie that these authors kind of have in coming together to tell these stories is maybe evident there.
Yeah, I think the horror community, social media, it doesn't matter, what kind of genre you're in. There's always going to be the flake outs occasionally, and
Yeah.
the little battles between people. But I think the one thing that I've noticed in 30 years in the horror industry is that everybody is really, really supportive of each other, and pretty nice. I mean, I probably can count the assholes that I've met in the horror genre on one hand.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
I don't know why it is. Maybe people work out their darker stuff when they write and to be a nicer person. I don't know. I maybe tend to think of that way about myself. So
yes,
that's true.
It's funny that Joe Hill has this a pretty well-known quote now. Cargill talks about it a lot, and which is to say that horror is not about extreme sadism; it's about extreme empathy. And the guy named and I get that. That makes sense. Miguel Rodriguez, who is the founder, and I think he's the founder. He's definitely the curator and manager of the Horrible Imaginings Film Fest. I think that's in San Diego. He describes horror as being an empathy building tool. I think, wow, there's really something to that.
Well, I don't think you can have an effective horror story unless you've got a character in there that you make the reader care about.
Yeah.
Because if you do all these things to that character, these horrible things that usually happen in a horror story, and the reader doesn't care about that character, they're not going to give a crap about what you do to that character.
Yes.
So I think, horror writers, probably more so than just about any other genre, exercise that empathy muscle in writing characters for their stories, because if you don't, you simply can't be effective at doing it. So
yes.
I think it does. And it also, I think what I like about horror is it's not just about that one single emotion of fear or terror or whatever. A good horror story usually draws out other emotions too, whether that's love and romance or jealousy or just the whole spectrum of emotional output.
Do you have and I asked this because I asked Ellen Datlow, another well-known editor anthologist, if she I mean she's introduced a whole lot of people to a whole lot of horror writers. I asked her if she had like a gold standard horror story, and she gave me 3 in particular that she thought were just really like, this really does everything a horror story ought to do. Do you have a classic, not necessarily 100 years old, but just kind of a classic that you consider a gold standard horror story?
When I try to think of the kind of horror stories that had an effect on me, one of the ones that leaps out a lot is Dread by Clive Barker. I don't know if you know that.
I have not read that one. No.
It's in the Books of Blood, and you think it's a pretty straightforward story going in, and the way, because it's got a sort of clinical detachment to what's going on in the story. And it turns in this sort of very Pit in the Pendulum kind of Poe-esque kind of thing, in the way that only Clive Barker can do that. And I like that. I like the fact that it's got a sort of sleight of hand about it that kind of eases you into what's going on. And then it kind of builds it very, very slowly. What is going on, how horrible it is, and then it jumps as to this is how horrible it is, but you're not even thinking of where it's going to be at the end, which is at a whole nother level.
Oh wow.
So I like that. I like the there's something to be said for a punch in the face at the beginning of a story, but I think there's also a lot more to be said for a story that kind of seduces you in.
Yes.
By building that base of fantasy kind of stories, which I guess a lot of horror might fall into the broad spectrum of that, work better when you establish a realism at some point in the story, because at some point in the story you're going to ask the reader to suspend some disbelief. And the best way to do that is to build a really solid foundation of reality, so when you make that leap as an author, the reader has no problem going along with you.
Yes.
So I think the stories that kind of are a softer, slower start work better for me. I mean,
Yes.
I prefer. But I think, any horror story where the writer has figured out how to get the reader to relax into the story before they, put the pins to them. That to me is the true nature of a good horror story.
Yeah, seduction's a good word for it. I like that a lot. I mean, I think about one of the all-time classics, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Yes. He starts off by just saying, but why would you think I'm mad? And he starts. I mean, you can see very quickly there's something really wrong with this guy, and yet he's just he's so winning and so fetching, and I mean, and you just kind of want to go along for the ride with them. And I would say that in Dark Stars, a good example of that would be Stephen Graham Jones's story, All the Things He Called Memories, where you can tell like it starts off as being kind of an ordinary, there's a couple, they're married, it's the pandemic. He doesn't have much work. He's an upholsterer.
Right.
And she is a college professor in the psychology department. They've suspended classes, or she's doing it from home. So they're stuck with each other. And he starts to wonder, is she kind of like experimenting on me because she got no one else to work with, no undergrads to observe or whatever. And you just kind of wonder, like, is he paranoid? And it kind of goes on for a while, but it does take a turn where it's something different than what you expect, or what it starts off as. And there was
I like it's that everyday stuff that kind of lulls you into thinking that this story, this is not bad, right? This is lovely. It's kind of a nice little story about this couple spending some time together during a pandemic, and then it just twists a little, and then it twists a little bit more, and then it twists a little bit more, and then at the end you're like, oh my God, what just happened?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back and talk about the author. Well, I do want to just say, Dan, congrats. This is an incredible list of authors. Like folks who, like Ramsey Campbell, who's been at this for a long time. He's kind of like the guy who is the connection between like the contemporary horror scene and the H.P. Lovecraft August Derleth set, because he correspondence with August Derleth, and
he had a story in the original in Dark Forces.
That's right.
Literally is the connective tissue between Dark Stars.
Now, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask about that. I've seen a lot of talk just recently in Twitter in particular, about the book Dark Forces. And of course, Dark Stars, even the title seems to be a bit of a nod to Dark Forces. And you referenced Dark Forces in your introduction to this. Tell me about that book, Dark Forces, and why it's so significant. Came out in 1980, so it's been around for a while. Tell me about that book.
Well, I think, Kirby McCauley, who was a pretty well-known agent back then, and really into horror, pulled Dark Forces together, I think, as a way to kind of show that the opinion that a lot of people had at the time, that horror was this sort of, you hear about it and you just sniff horror. I mean, good grief.
Yes.
Even more so than a lot of literary people sniff at science fiction or fantasy or whatnot. It really was the lowest of lowbrow. Literary orientations.
Yes.
But he wanted to show that horror has these roots that go way back, and that horror is indeed and can be a very literary genre. I mean, he had authors like Isaac Bashevis Singer and Joyce Carol Oates, Bradbury.
Yep.
And I think for me, that book came out at just about the time that I had really started to get into horror. So I was reading King and Rice and Barker and Straub, and when that book came around, it really got me hooked on horror short stories, particularly.
Yes.
And I went and explored, the Books of Blood and Night Shift and all the early sort of anthologies that came out around that time. Early for the genre.
Yes.
So for me, I think in helping cement horror as a thing that I was not only interested in reading but also writing.
Yeah.
Dark Forces was sort of that pivot
Yes.
Me. And I think also it had an effect, I think, that you can see on horror in the rise of people like Straub, particularly, who was a very literary horror writer, and even Anne Rice, who's a very literary kind of horror writer. I think it really showed that these people are producing things that you can't just hold your nose up at.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Right.
I see. This was the first appearance. This is the debut of Stephen King's novella *The Mist*, which is one of his better known, more very very successful stories. Obviously, You mentioned Ramsey Campbell with *The Brood* and T.E.D. Klein with *Children of the Kingdom*, which went on to be part of his collection *Dark Gods*, which is another one that's kind of a seminal work.
Right.
So
it was a big deal, I think, in the industry as a whole, and as for me as a writer and a reader growing up. So when I was casting about with Josh, trying to figure out ways we could work together on a project,
Josh Malerman.
Yes. And I thought, why don't we do an anthology? And then when we kind of narrowed it down to that, I thought, here's this dark forces back there in the 80s, and no one has really touched it since then. No one has really done anything that I think would either follow up on that or be a tribute to that. So once we hit on that, everything came together pretty quickly. We thought of a title pretty quickly, and then I approached a number of authors who immediately said yes. And then it kind of it took a while to kind of wind its way through, how are we going to do this, and who are going to invite, who's going to say yes, and then finding a publisher. And luckily, this goes back to I think the StokerCon in Providence a number of years ago, where Usman T. Malik, who's a writer that I'd known and admired, said, I know you're doing this, and I have a contact at Tor that might be interested.
Wow.
You want me to put this together for you and put you two together? And I'm like, sure. And as we're talking here, would you want to do a story for us?
Wow.
And he said, yeah. So once we got it hooked up with Tor, it came together pretty quickly.
Okay. And I just got to say, Usman, I don't know how he does it. He's a physician, right? He's a rheumatologist. I think I'm not sure if he's in Florida or Pakistan now, but he's a multinational rheumatologist.
Yeah, he's in Pakistan right now.
Okay.
Trying to get him to do some of these media things for Dark Stars. It's just a little difficult coordinating time jump.
That's right. That's right.
But he has a wonderful, he would have fit perfectly in Dark Forces because he has a wonderful literary sense to his stories that are just terrific. So so once we got it with Tor, it came together pretty quick. I'll tell you how quick. When Tor said that they were interested, I think I had about, maybe 3 or 4 people committed.
Yeah.
That they were going to do it.
Yeah.
But I had a list of names that I was going to approach, and they were like, okay, fine. Fill out the rest of this table of contents as quickly as you can. I filled it in a day.
Wow. Really?
Once I had the commitment from the publisher, and I said, we've already got Malerman committed. Got Usman Malik committed, and I can't remember who else, but I had a couple of other people committed at the time. They were like, yeah, absolutely, sign me up. So I don't really think I had anybody. I had somebody, and I'm not going to say who, but I had somebody who had to bow out, who had originally said yes just because of the timing.
Yeah.
I'm going to get him for the next one.
That sounds awesome. That sounds great.
Follow up to this.
Yeah. But again, like the list of people you have in here, Livia Llewellyn. And we don't get a lot of new stories from her often. So getting that is an absolute treasure. I'm a big fan of hers. Alma Katsu, whose career has just blown up in the last year, where now she's got TV productions going on. Gemma Files, Josh Malerman and John Langan. It really is a who's who of horror that's in this book.
I had the laundry list of people that I wanted to get, that they were my dream names.
Yeah.
And almost everybody.
Yeah.
I was worried going in that people like, Livia, who doesn't produce a lot, she's not a hugely prolific person.
Yeah.
And then Alma, who hadn't really written much short fiction. So I was thinking there would be a number of different scenarios where people would turn me down.
Yeah.
But, everybody came back and said yes. And everybody was, it was such an easy project. Everybody was very easy to work with.
Oh, that's great.
You had talked about the serendipities between the stories.
Yeah.
And there were a number of weird things that were,
the book does not have a theme, right?
No,
I mean, totally. like Dark Forces, it's not themed. I get the sense it's more of a showcase of, hey world, look, there is some incredible horror work being done in the horror genre, and here's a good sample of it.
Yeah, I think when most publishers tell you about anthologies, they tell you to stay away from unthemed ones, because unthemed ones don't sell as well as the theme ones. But I think the best way for a reader who's either got a little bit of a background in horror or who knows even a little bit more about horror is to read an unthemed anthology and see what the author is really capable of producing when they don't have a prompt given to them by whatever the theme of the anthology is. And that's what I wanted to do. And I also wanted to give them a little bit more room than just a 5,000 word short story to write. So they were given not really guide rails. It was sort of like, keep it around 10,000, 12,000 words.
Yeah.
John Langan went way over that. But that was also serendipitous. And I'll touch on that in a second.
I'd love to hear that.
Given the fact that I gave no one any direction, we've got a number of different, like Stephen Graham Jones's story and Livia's story, both concern industrial sewing.
That's right. That's right. Isn't that strange? Yes. Yeah. Upholstery, specifically upholstery. Yes.
Right. Stephen Graham Jones's story and my story involve both the pandemic and isolation.
Yes.
Both took characters that were sort of in modern times, in today times, and isolated them tremendously.
Yes.
The thing about Langan's story that is so cool is that going back to Dark Forces, all of those stories were short stories. They were all mostly in the 5,000 word range until you got to The Mist.
Yes.
So The Mist was a true novella. It's got to be between 20 and 30,000 words, I think. And Kirby decided to close Dark Forces with that story. So when I got Langan's story in, and I got it in last,
yes,
and he had gone over, it was like 21,000 or 22,000 words for his story, and it took me aback at first, but then I thought, well, here's your end story. Just right. As Kirby Macaulay ended his book with a longer piece by King, I'll end Dark Stars with a longer piece by Langan, and it worked perfectly.
Yes, and it is a little bit, to me at least, a little bit reminiscent of The Fisherman, in that it's a story, a kind of a story within a story. There's a narrative told. Two characters have a face-off, kind of basically an unarmed face-off, and it's almost like they're fighting with narrative. It's a very strange piece and a very John Langan piece.
It's a very John Langan piece, but also in some ways it's not, because Langan tends to be very literary.
Yeah.
And that story has got some really grotesque moments.
It's very grisly. It surprised me how grisly it was, because I don't think of John Langan as being that grisly, and it gets descriptive.
It does, and in a good way. I mean, he handles it really, really well.
Yeah.
And I think when you read, there are notes at the back of the book from each of the authors who I gave some room to talk about where they came up with the idea, or how they wrote it, or what they were thinking of. And John, kind of said in that piece that he did it kind of as a dare. He wrote the stories kind of as a dare. And I think it was Brian Keene who had said, I wonder if Langan can really write a piece that's just extremely grotesque.
Yeah, nice. Well, hey, thank you, Brian Keene.
Yeah,
because your dare apparently has produced something really that's quite grisly and effective, and yet so John Langan at the same time. I love that.
Absolutely. But I think For an unrelated anthology, there are little squirrely little things where, as an editor, I sat back and I'm like, there's got to be something weird at work here, because to have these weird little similarities between the stories is kind of weird. It's unique.
Yes. Well, one thing I noticed in these stories is that there's more than one, I'll say, that use, we think about, what are the sources of fear in horror stories, like the fear of the unknown. Okay, sure. Yeah, that's probably the biggest one. But in this case, I think there's a fear of, you don't know if your senses are telling you what's really going on. There's the fear of the loss of veracity in your own perception of time, of consciousness, of what's going on around you, what you think's going on around you. And it's pretty jarring, and it shows up in several of the stories. At Ramsey Campbell's is a really interesting one, where you've got this basically a school kid, Maurice, and you get a look at his life as it goes through several decades, at least 20, maybe 25, 30 years of his life. Well, actually, it goes quite a bit longer than that, now that I think about it. And you really kind of get this. It's very jarring and unnerving, because you're slipping pretty quickly through scenes of this guy's life, and you don't know if is this just like a guy who's got memory problems, or is something else happening to him. It is from the beginning, like you get this. He does this wonderful thing with the kid. He thinks he's hearing something, but it doesn't make any sense. So he's really messing with this kid, become a man later, with his senses.
Yeah, and it's that sense of synchronicity also is, you've got Ramsey's story, which is very fractured reality.
Yes.
And then Josh's story, which is also fractured reality, and people not knowing exactly where they are, what time period they're at.
Yes.
So yeah, there is quite a bit of that. And I should go back and say it was serendipitous to get Ramsey at all, because when I first thought about Ramsey, I thought, well, I'll just have him see if he'll write the afterword.
Yeah.
And I thought, if I could get that, that'll be gold. If I can get that. So when I went to him and I said, here's what we're doing, and would you be interested in reading the stories or writing the afterward? And he said, yeah, I would be interested in doing that. I would also be interested in writing a new story for you. And I thought, okay, well, I was planning on that, but how can you turn Ramsey Campbell down?
You can't. And what a gem he's produced.
I'm glad. I'm glad that it all worked out, because it's a fantastic story.
Yeah.
It's utterly Ramsey Campbell, but again, it seems to fit within the weird structure that this book has. So
yeah, absolutely. I think as people, and I would love for other, once the book comes out and people read it, I hope they go onto social media and onto goodreads.com and other places and talk about what they're seeing, because there's some really interesting connections that I've just noticed so far. But overall, there's just like a lot of great stories by so many really terrific authors. Now, I wonder, did you were you surprised by what any of the authors delivered? I know it's themeless, it's open, you can do whatever you want, but did any of them just really surprise you, like maybe something that's different from what that author typically writes, perhaps?
Langan was probably the one that leaps to mind in that regard. But I got to tell you, I think probably the thing that it didn't surprise me actually as much as delight me. I asked Caroline Kepnes. One of the things that I thought about doing when I put this book together was really pushing the boundaries of what people think of as horror, to show readers that horror shows up in all sorts of different ways in what genres you may consider to be outside of horror. And I had been in a book with Caroline called Lullabies for Suffering. It was put up by Mark Matthews, and it's a book on addiction horror.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, he wrote a really great story in that. I think it's called Monsters. And so I thought, when I was looking at expanding what I was doing with Dark Stars, I thought, I'll ask her to see what she's interested in. And, she's another one like Josh, who's got a lot going on. She's got television series made out of books, She's prolific, and but she signed on board right away. And
Wow.
when I got her story, and I don't know where in the process I actually got it, but I knew when I read it that it was probably going to be the first story. It was probably going to be a kickoff story, because just as as I said, I like stories that kind of lull you in with kind of a false sense of comfort. I wanted Dark Stars. I wanted the order of the stories to do that too, where the first story you read, you think, this is horror. This is horror. This is just it's oh my God. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think Caroline does that effectively with her story.
Yes. And you mentioned addiction horror.
Yeah.
Alma Katsu has one called The Familiar's Assistant, and it
Yes.
really takes a pretty good look at addiction. But it's you have the protagonist, Eric, is a guy who's he's tried probably a lot of different drugs, lives kind of on the edge of society, has a job, but he clearly has his kind of shadowy side here, and he comes looking for a high of a kind of a legendary kind, and gets mixed up with something that's much bigger than anything he's ever done before. But and he starts to get into the horror and the weird space there. But it's very much a story of addiction and what it drives people to do.
Yeah, and without revealing what it is she's writing about, because better the reader get that. But when I first got the story, I have to be honest, I was a little worried that she chose to deal with that trope. But she did it wonderfully, and she upended it beautifully. I think it's a story that people may go into like I did and think, oh God, and then you're like, oh God, that's a really good look at that particular trope, and giving it a totally different spin.
It is. I know what you mean, because there are films on this subject that are very popular, and I'm sure novels as well. But it does have an approach that I think is very different from what I've seen before. It's it's very dark.
It's brutal. It's a brutal.
Yeah. And it's interesting because once you get into it, you see exactly what's going on. There's not a lot of mystery left, though it does end on an ambiguous note. I think is really interesting. But then I think about like Livia Llewellyn's story called Volcano, and it's playing around with, well, I mean, first it is a totally Livia Llewellyn story, and again, I just love her work. There's just this tone and this pressure, and I don't know, like, what really is the nature of the horror or the concern. There's something going on that her protagonist, Callie, who's a pretty, well, kind of a despicable character. I mean, she's just a very angry and not very, let me just say, unscrupulous person. But she gets into this situation where she's going to do some work on campus at the college in Ellensburg, and we've seen the campus at Ellensburg and other Livia stories, and she gets involved with kind of a guy who helps run maintenance for the place, and another student or young man who's going to help with the work, and it just gets weirder and weirder. But so much of it is just in the tone. There's also some stuff going on with the elements. If you just kind of look at the 4 basic elements, you'll see like there's some weird stuff. I don't know how to describe the nature of this threat.
Livia's story to me is a masterclass in the horror of ambiguity. How you can really take a story and you don't have to, as the author, paint everything. It's not a paint by colors kind of thing where everything is totally illuminated and the reader knows exactly what's going on at any given time. It's a harder story to do because you've got to give the reader just enough to get that tone and that discomfort across. But she really does it masterfully. It builds to the point where by the time you reach the end, you're probably saying in one half of your mind, what the hell did I just read? But on the other hand, oh my God, that's really uncomfortable.
It is, yes. Yeah. It makes me just, I mean, and she's a I describe her work as she just writes dangerously.
Yes.
It is. I'm concerned sometimes reading her work because like what she's putting her characters through is so frightening, and I don't know where her characters are going to end up in this story, but I'm deeply concerned for them. But they have this experience. It's very strange, but I won't say anything more. But I
love the story.
It's great to see Livia back with a fresh story, and I hope to see more from her coming up. Another one I'll point out. I hope I get this right. Gemma Files' story, the Sanguintalist is. What did you know kind of where she was going to go with that story before she turned it in?
No, but I know Gemma well enough to know that, not to know, but to probably hope that it was going to kind of go in a more, what would you call that? Kind of a neo-noir, supernatural noir kind of direction. And one of the reasons I asked her to be in it is, again, to pull the boundary over to where she's writing, because I'm not sure that, she's written books like experimental film and that kind of stuff. So people think of her, I think, as a horror writer, but it's sort of at a boundary between horror and dark fantasy and magical realism and that kind of thing. So
very, very much so. I mean, it is like probably a little bit in the future, or it's an alternate history thing. There's some things that we would look at as being supernatural that are magical realism that are happening in the world, but it's a very noir story as well. It's kind of not a police procedural, but it's very involved with a crime that's committed.
And I think what she did, I applaud what she did, because I think that anybody that is able to put those two things together, the noir sensibilities grafted onto like a horror, dark fantasy story, really hard to do, because first of all, noir is hard to write. It's hard to write without falling into that pastiche of Hammett or Chandler. And too many writers that tackle that fall into that. It just it sounds awful. But she was able to straddle that line, I think, nicely between the noir stuff and making it just noir enough to get the point, to get the atmosphere, but also it lended itself very well toward the magical realism and the horror supernatural aspects of it. So that was, to me, that was a really great high wire act that she did with that story.
It is very, very impressive, and as I mentioned on Twitter yesterday, convinced me I've got to read more of Gemma's work. I've read some of her short stories, but I need to read a lot more.
Experimental film, I would highly recommend.
Yes, I've heard that's on my short list to pick up, because it's pretty legendary book. Can we talk a little bit about the story that you wrote, and let's talk about the story, and then I want to ask you about the kind of the difference between, I guess, the full, coming to this project as an editor and coming to this project as an author, and kind of how those two different roles, I guess, pay off in terms of your satisfaction with the experience of putting something together. But let's talk about the story just for a minute. And this story is really about three people, husband, wife, and a child. There's a traumatic experience, and the story is really about kind of the rage of the dying and the lostness of those who lose them, I guess. And I think toward the end we get a sense of this, maybe this inevitable growing apart that even the closest of relationships can have. It is very much about relationships, and it's a very, very tender story, and a very in its way distressing story as well. But you really get a look at the kind of the emotional dynamics between a family, a husband, wife, and their child, and even like kind of competition between them and stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, what led you to write this story called "Swim in the Blood of a Curious Dream"?
Which I stole from a Guster song, one of my favorite bands.
Okay, I was wondering where that came from, because I know that there's a reference to maybe the idea of a curious dream being perhaps something that's maybe more of a German phrase, or an idea. I think his mom, the boy's mom, came up with that phrase or used it.
I wanted to explore how, there's that kind of trite thing that divorce is like a death.
Yeah.
But I wanted to turn that over and look at, well, maybe death is sort of like a divorce.
Yes.
Um, so what are some of the similarities between the two, and what kind of an effect does that have on everybody involved, not just the parents but the child? So so it kind of came from there. And then we were driving somewhere, my wife and I, on a trip, and I do my best thinking in the car when I'm
Yes.
probably should be paying more attention to where I'm going, what I'm doing. But we passed a rest area, and I thought it would be kind of cool to have a story that's set in a rest area. And I think that as we talked about, Stephen Graham Jones's story and my story both isolate their characters.
Yes.
And I think that's a great setting for a horror story, when you can isolate people from the real world and contain their dealings to just a small number of characters, and see how that all plays out in that very small little setting.
Yes.
So when I started thinking about the two ideas, as usually what happens to me was when I have one idea and I have another idea and I put them together, it sparks the story.
Interesting.
So that's kind of where it all came out. And I think that, I'm 58 years old and I've been through a lot in my life, and I had kids, and I went through a nasty divorce a long time ago. And how did that make me feel? And how did that affect the relationship I have with my children? And just all those things you struggle with when you're going through that kind of thing, and just take all that and turn it up, as they say in a Spinal Tap 211.
Yes.
And see how that all plays out when it's amplified.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm glad you pointed out. I felt the story was tender, that there was a definite heart to the story, and probably a melancholy to the story, because it's sort of there is an inevitability to all this, and that we're all going to have to kind of face that at one point or another.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted, the last lines of the story to me were the most chilling. That the child would have something, the father would have something to tell the child.
Yes.
But also the child, because of what happens in the story, is probably going to have some screwed up things to tell the father.
Yes, the story has a resolution, but not really, because where's it gonna? I mean, it's a very strange ending. I applaud you for that. It really is. It takes on some mythic dimensions, or echoes, I should say. There's a mythic echo to it, and I think most readers will probably recognize it once they read it. They'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But there's a resolution, but emotionally, it's left wide open as to how the father and the son are going to relate to each other going forward.
And as an author, I've been writing for, I don't know, 30 some odd years, 40 years, probably 40 years, close to 40 years at this point. And I found, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more comfortable in leaving the reader at a spot where they can use their own imagination to kind of think about the ending, or where the ending might go, or to give them just enough information to achieve whatever emotion that I'm trying to get after, but also leaving it open a little, so you can think, wow, this might get actually a lot worse.
Yeah. Now, did you have the story before you thought of this idea? Okay, so this is one that you came up with. You and Josh Malerman came up with the idea of Dark Stars, put this together.
At some point, we decided that I was just going to be the ringleader for it.
Yep.
And he was just going to write the introduction and his story. And, me deciding to be the editor of the book and then putting a story in the book was, that was a difficult decision to make.
Of course.
It always kind of smacks of ego when an editor sticks one of their own stories in. And I'm no different. But I thought long and hard about it. And I just thought, this is really a passion project for me.
Yeah.
And if it were just something like the Bad Book, when I edited that, and David Alexander Ward, who owns Bleeding Edge Books, who published it, asked me, do you want to put a story in? And I just thought, no, I don't want to. I think should purely be me coaxing a great story out of the people that I've assembled for that book. Yeah. But Dark Stars felt different. It really felt like a passion thing for me. And I just thought, to be honest with you bluntly, well, screw that. If I'm doing this, I'm putting a story in it.
Nice.
And people can think what they want, and the cards fall where they may, but it was also fraught with a lot of, well, if you're going to put one of your own stories in with a lot of these people, you got to make sure it's a damn good story.
Yeah.
You know,
yes.
You got to rise to the occasion and write something that fits in with this.
Yeah. And my opinion is, I think people are going to see it stands up very well with the other stories.
You don't want to be the person. Well, you don't want to be the person in any anthology that has a story where people go, "Well, I really love that book, but
yes,
one story." So, that just played on my anxieties more than anything else. But I'm proud of the story. I think it worked, and again, weirdly, it serendipitously fits, adjacent to some of the other stories in there. So it works. I think.
So what's the tell me what's the feeling like of bringing you bring a short story into the world. You've got this beautiful little short story, and you brought a book into the world with 12 terrific stories. I mean, that's and as an editor, maybe that's more of a kind of a, you think about a midwife or a doula sort of thing, as an analogy versus a mom giving birth to a baby, maybe. But what does it feel like to you to have done both of those?
It's odd. I mean, when other anthologies that I've been in, I have a story, and I really tried to help the person who puts the book together to move that book. So I get out there in social media and push the book and talk about the stories and pimp the other authors in the book. And I certainly have done that for my own stuff. When I've got a collection or a novel out, I do that. But this is, this is again so weirdly personal in a way that it's a different way than a novel. I mean, obviously a novel or a collection of my own is very personal, but having come up with the idea, having come up with the name, having come up with the list of authors, having put myself out there to invite people, some of whom I, thought for sure they're going to turn me down, and then working with a connection that I got from somebody to reach a publisher who was excited about it, and then to work with that publisher in trying to put together the absolute best version of this book that we possibly can, with a great cover and fantastic editing on their part. It's a whole different thing. It's a whole, I really do feel like this is a bigger birth for some reason than turning over a collection or a novel to a publisher, and then you participate in the rewrites and the editing and that kind of stuff, but then it just slides away. They pick up a cover and they decide how it's going to appear, when it's going to appear, and all that kind of stuff. But I was pretty involved. In fact, I really had thought that working with Tor was going to be a little bit more of an arm's length relationship.
Yeah.
They really involved me in really every decision, except for the, frankly, hardcore business decisions.
Yeah.
But I was involved in the cover and awesome. All that sort of stuff, which I didn't think that I probably was going to be involved in. So it's really nice. And I really, probably more than anything else that I've done up to this point, weirdly and maybe stupidly and maybe naively and maybe, over grandiosely, I really hope that this, what we've created is one that's going to be pertinent in the genre for a while.
Yes.
That people, I flatter myself to think, and hopefully it will, that somebody is going to read this book and be as affected by the book and the stories in the book as I was by Dark Forces back in 1980. So I hope so.
Yes. Well, and getting this deal with Tor Nightfire, as I understand, um, they don't publish that many books in a given year. If you get on their publishing calendar, that's a big deal. And I have heard that they really push, do a good job with marketing and pushing the books they do publish.
They were incredible, and they had just started out. Dark Stars is going to be one of the first, I think, 5 or 6 books that that imprint has published.
Mm-hmm.
They've got the Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward, and I know they just put a book out by Thomas Hoyville, which is a phenomenal book, Echo.
Yeah.
And so they've had a few, but not many. So when they said yes, I was like, wow. That's incredible. So
yes.
I think I flatter myself to think that they saw this. To me, wanting to do a follow-up to Dark Forces is when we had the idea, it was sort of like, I can't believe nobody else has thought about this.
Yeah.
That they haven't done this before. So I was more than happy to step into that and say, well, I'll do it.
That's really exciting to hear. Just for people who are now kind of interested in seeing what Dark Forces was about, is it hard to get a copy of that? I think there was a new release or a reprint or something in 2006 or 7, but it sounds like that sold out immediately.
My original issue was a softcover issue, and I lost it a long time ago. I went and looked for it vainly in all my books, but I think somewhere in all the moves that I've done over the years, I lost it, or it got destroyed or something. So I had to go back online and find a copy. And my copy, which is a book club version, it's probably a book club version that was bought by a library, and then it's got that slick overlay on the slipcover.
Yeah,
it was $60.
Wow.
Yeah, it was expensive.
Okay, well, let's just start off with Dark Stars, because that's going to be widely available in about 9 days from this recording. Right. So we'll stick with that for right now. Yeah. But Dark Forces one to look for.
Well, if you can find it, find it at a used bookstore or something, it's probably one of those things that's a hidden gem.
Yes,
that maybe the bookstore doesn't even know what they've got there, but it's well worth getting. I mean, again, just for just to see the original appearance of the Mist.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the price right there.
Absolutely.
But it's filled with great stories.
Hey, tell me this as we start to wind down. You dedicated the book to teachers. In the dedication, you say this book is dedicated to all the teachers who spend their time nurturing talent, imparting wisdom, and gently nudging people toward fulfilling their potential. Tell me about that. Why was that important to dedicate it to teachers?
I look at how I fell into writing, and I think that it's no different than anybody who tackles an art as a career choice. You've got to be nurtured at some point to do that, whether that's your parents or grandparents or somebody in your family or friends who are very supportive of what you do. But I think the common denominator in a lot of people who pursue the arts is a teacher. At some point along the line, that teacher, in whatever setting, saw the talent that you might have for whatever it is, dancing, painting, writing, whatever it is, and nurtured that talent. And without that person, I think in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases, if there wasn't an inflection point of that person really supporting you and really pushing you in that direction, sometimes I think that may not have happened for some people, that if they hadn't had that at the right time, they might not have gone into whatever there is that their talent calls them to do. So, and I know that for me, I was writing stupid little things in grade school and stupid little things in high school. And then when I got to college, I have an English degree.
Me too.
And I wrote things for the literary magazine and submitted them and got some feedback from professors and whatnot. And it just, it seemed, nobody wanted me to write horror. They all poo-pooed that.
I'm sure.
But I got a lot of encouragement along the way from teachers And I think it's one of those, unfortunately, there's a lot of them in America these days, but it's one of these unsung professions that people don't realize how vitally important it is for kids, and not just going into the arts. I mean, just to have that encouragement on any level that you're intelligent and you're curious, and all of these things are important about your personality, so that people feel like they can go out and do things with the talent that they've been given. And a lot of times that's a teacher, and we don't pay them enough. We stress them too much.
The last two, I mean, during the pandemic, these last 2.5 years, what a time of incredible pressure put on teachers and school administrators.
And if people can't see now how important that is, because you can do it on a screen. It's difficult.
Yeah.
It can be done, but to be in a classroom in person with 30 or some odd kids, each who has different needs and different wants and desires and talents and anxieties and all the stuff that goes into that, and to be able to be a person that can deal with that stuff and deal with it well, and as the icing on that cake, also encourage children to blossom in the ways that they're meant to blossom. That's a special kind of person, I think.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
And I know I had a lot of them in my past, so I wanted to kind of pay homage to that.
That's wonderful. And I just think coming hopefully toward the end of this pandemic phase, with what teachers have been through and schools in general, what they've been through, what a great time to dedicate a book to teachers. So I just noticed that and thought that was really cool.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
It's a usually it's a friend or a family member that I dedicate the book to, but it seemed more appropriate this time to since this book was due to such an influence on me.
Yes.
Back when I was doing it, that teachers also being an influence on me and a lot of people, it just seemed like the right dedication to make.
Absolutely. What's the next big project? I imagine you'll continue to write, individual works of fiction, but what's the next big project for you?
I've got a sort of sci-fi horror novel that my agent is shopping around.
Nice.
I've got a it's not really a YA, but it's a nostalgic 1970s kind of coming of age thriller horror book. I've got two collections. I've got a cosmic horror novella collection, and then I've just put the finishing touches on another short story collection. So I've got all these four things that the agent is juggling. Hopefully we're going to see some movement on those soon. I've got some short stories coming out. I've got one coming out in Mark Matthews' book called Orphans of Bliss, which is his third addiction horror anthology that I think is coming out in May. And then I've got a book in Doug Morano's The Hideous Book of Hidden Horrors.
Wow.
That's going to be out in May too, I believe. And then I can't remember. I got lots of stuff. This year.
Now, and if someone's just not familiar with your work, what's the best book to start on, or the best series to start on to start learning your work?
I really came up through short fiction. It's really still my love of all the different formats that you can write in. So I think a good overview for my writing are the three fiction collections I have. The End and All Beginnings, which is the one that I was Stoker nominated for. That's got 5 novellas. And then the 2 short story collections, Little Deaths, which what they call a definitive edition was put out by Great Matter Press a couple of years ago, and it's got 24 short stories in it.
Cool.
And then my latest one that was now a couple of years old now is called Little Black Spots, that I think has 16 short stories in it, and those are a mixture of previously published stuff and newer stuff. So I think if you're not familiar with me, then those 3 collections are probably a good introduction to how I write and the kinds of things I write about. So
very good. Awesome. And I think probably most active on Twitter in terms of social media. Would that be
Yeah,
right?
social media is one of those things that I have to choose my poison.
Yes.
And I don't particularly like Facebook for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Instagram, I think I'm too old for. So Twitter has been good to me. I'm able to kind of press my books and help other people kind of get better awareness for their stuff and mix in some tiny bits of personal information. So yeah, Twitter is, you can find me at John F. D. Taft, at John F. D. Taft.
Yeah, Taff, Taff, and I'll make sure I put that in the notes for the YouTube video. Well, John, what a pleasure it's been to
have
chat
a
with
newsletter.
you.
If you go to my site and go to my profile, there's a newsletter that I do.
Okay.
And I've got a website, but it's kind of under construction right now. So those are the ways to get a hold of me.
Sounds good. So definitely follow him. You've got a lot of followers on Twitter. So everyone go ahead and follow John there on Twitter. I think that'll be a good starting point. Any last words, anything you want to share with us before we end this?
No, I think it's a great time for horror. It's a great time to be reading horror. It's a great time to be writing it. There are so many people who are really tearing it up out there writing horror. And I could go on reciting a name as long as, we could spend another 90 minutes of me just reciting names.
Yes.
So it's a great time to be out there reading it. And I think if Dark Stars is an entree for anybody, then I think it was time well spent on my part and the authors who wrote the stories for it.
Absolutely. Well, again, congrats on a terrific book. Getting these authors together and the stories are really dynamite. I think it's going to be a big hit.
Well, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.